Tonight we are going to talk about the wars that happened before the wars, you know. Not the Battle of Helm's Deep, not the Pelennor Fields, not the last stand at the Black Gate where Aragorn looked at the soldiers he was asking to die and told them the truth about their odds. You know those battles. You have seen those battles. You have felt the weight of them in your chest, the way you feel the weight of something real. Tonight, we are going to go deeper, older, into the battles that the survivors of the War of the Ring grew up hearing about, as legend, as ancient history, as things that happened in ages so remote they might as well be myth. The battles that built the world Frodo walked into. The wars that shaped every kingdom, every alliance, every piece of geography that determined whether the free peoples of Middle-earth lived or died in the War of the Ring. Here is what most people who love Tolkien don't fully understand. The world of the Lord of the Rings is a ruin. Not metaphorically, literally. The kingdoms Aragorn inherits, the alliances he rebuilds, the cities still standing when the ring is destroyed. They are the remnant of a civilization that was once far larger, far more powerful, far more magnificent, and that was beaten down by war after war after war across thousands of years, until what was left was small enough, and tired enough, and depleted enough that a single ring of power and a single Dark Lord with a tower and some armies could nearly end the entire story of the free peoples in a single generation. You want to understand why Gondor is holding the line with a fraction of its ancient strength? Why the northern kingdom of Arnor doesn't exist anymore at all? Why Rohan, that magnificent horse culture of the plain, is only 500 years old? Why Sauron knew, when he looked at the map of the world from Barad-dûr, that the window was open? Why he thought he could actually win? Because he had been winning. Not him personally. He had servants for that. But the darkness he represents, the grinding erosion of the free peoples, the slow bleeding of every civilization that dared to resist, that had been winning for a very long time. Tonight, we are going to follow that long defeat. We are going to start at the beginning of recorded history in Tolkien's world and walk forward, battle by battle, war by war, all the way to the morning when Frodo left the Shire with a ring in his pocket and the whole world on his shoulders. And by the time we're done, you will understand something about the Lord of the Rings that the movies never had time to tell you. You will understand why the story almost didn't happen, why the free peoples almost ran out of road a dozen times before they even got to Sauron, why the men who stood at the Black Gate were not the heirs of an unbroken tradition of victory. They were the last people standing. Settle in. This goes all the way back to the beginning. Part 1. The world before the world you know. Before there was Middle-earth in any form a traveller from our world would recognize, there was Beleriand. Most people who love The Lord of the Rings have heard the name. It appears in the appendices. Tolkien references it in Rivendell conversations that feel ancient, even in a story about ancient things. But most readers don't have a vivid picture of it, because Beleriand is gone. Not conquered, not ruined. Gone, under the sea, drowned. In the cataclysm that ended the First Age, the entire western portion of the continent that would become Middle-earth was physically destroyed and submerged. What you see on the maps in The Lord of the Rings, the coastline, the blue mountains that mark the western edge of the familiar world, is the eastern edge of Beleriand. Everything west of those mountains is now ocean. That drowned continent was the stage for the bloodiest, most desperate, most magnificent sequence of wars in the history of Tolkien's world. 5 great battles, each more costly than the last. Civilizations built and destroyed. Heroes who became legends. And behind all of it, shaping every disaster, orchestrating every catastrophe, Morgoth. Not Sauron, Morgoth, the original Dark Lord. The being that Sauron served, the power that Sauron was the shadow of. A Valar, one of the great divine intelligences who sang the world into being, who chose to turn that creative power toward destruction. Morgoth in his fortress of Angband, in the Iron Mountains of the far north, with armies of orcs and balrogs and dragons, and the darkness of a will that had been corrupted across ages of time, until there was nothing left of it that was not the desire to unmake everything Ilúvatar had made. The elves stood against him. The Noldor, those greatest of craftsmen, those most gifted of the elvish peoples, who had walked in Valinor and seen the light of the two trees, and who crossed the grinding ice to come back to Middle-earth in defiance of the Valar's command because they were angry and they would not be stopped. The Noldor built kingdoms in Beleriand, and they fought Morgoth with everything they had for nearly 600 years. They lost. They lost beautifully, and they lost completely. And the manner of their losing shaped the next 10,000 years of Middle-earth's history. The wars of Beleriand are where tonight's story starts. Not because they are the most famous wars. They are not. Not because most fans know them. Most don't. Because they are the wars that created the world. Every kingdom that Tolkien names in The Lord of the Rings traces its lineage, one way or another, back to the survivors of Beleriand. Every piece of elvish wisdom, every artifact of elvish craft, every great elvish figure still walking in the Third Age. Their history goes back through those wars, through those losses, through the specific quality of grief that comes from having built something magnificent and watched it burn. By the time we get to Frodo's journey, we will understand why the elves of Rivendell feel the way they do. Why Galadriel has that quality about her. Not sadness exactly, but the specific weight of someone who has seen too much to be surprised by loss, and too much to be indifferent to it. Why Glorfindel, who helps Frodo at the ford of Bruinen, carries himself the way he does. But we have to start at the very beginning, before the sun rose for the first time, before the moon. In the starlight that was the only light the first elves ever knew. Before Feanor's sons led the Noldor back across the sea, and the wars of Beleriand really began. Before all of that, there was a battle so completely forgotten that it doesn't even have a name most readers know. Part 2. The Battle with No Name. Before Feanor crossed the sea. Before the Noldor came back to Middle-earth with their grief and their anger, and their 3 Silmarils stolen, and their king dead. Before any of the famous wars that Tolkien scholars argue about with such pleasure. In the first period of elvish existence, when the stars were the only lights in the world, and the first elves were living in Beleriand, with only the Sindar and the Nandor for company, Morgoth attacked. 2 armies. Coming from Angband, which had been silent long enough that the elves had started to believe the silence might be peace. One host went west through the pass of Sirion, cutting into the heart of Beleriand. One host went east through the gap between the Blue Mountains and the Misty Mountains, coming at them from the flank. It was not a random assault. Morgoth had mapped his enemy. He knew where the elves were weakest, and he struck there first. The western assault was beaten back by Thingol, the great king of the Sindar, who would become the lord of Doriath and whose people carried the memory of this first war in their bones. But it cost him. It cost him the time he needed to reach his ally. In the east, a lord you almost certainly don't know was fighting and dying. His name was Denethor, not the steward of Gondor, different Denethor, First Age, Lord of the Nandor, the green elves of Osiriand, who had never walked in Valinor and who fought with bows and light weapons, because that was what they had. Morgoth's eastern host came around their flank on a hill called Amon Ereb, and the Nandor were surrounded, and Denethor died there with most of his people because Thingol's reinforcement came too late. The eastern host was eventually broken by the Dwarves of Mount Dolmed, who caught the orcs retreating through their passes and destroyed them in the mountain darkness that dwarves have always owned. The western host was beaten in the Pass of Sirion. Morgoth's first assault on the elvish kingdoms of Beleriand was repelled. But here is what that battle actually cost, and why it matters for everything that follows. Thingol, watching Denethor die, watching the Nandor suffer because the assault was too wide and his response too slow, looked at the open geography of Beleriand and understood something that would define his entire subsequent strategy. The land was too big to defend at the borders. The only survivable response was to pull inward, to concentrate, to fortify from the center rather than holding the edges. He raised the girdle of Melian. His queen, Melian the Maya, threw a boundary of enchantment around the realm of Doriath, a fence that no enemy could cross without Thingol's will. And Doriath became, for the next 5 centuries, the most secure fortress in Beleriand, impenetrable, protected by divine power. And the rest of Beleriand, everything outside Doriath's borders, was left to manage for itself. The surviving Nandor, grief-stricken by their lord's death, swore an oath that they would never name a king or fight in open battle again. They became the quietest people in Middle-earth, fading into the forests, barely there at all. 1,000 years later, they would break that oath once for the great battle they believed could end everything, and that decision, made in grief for everything the first battle had taken, would cost them almost their entire people. One battle before the sun rose, before the world was named, and it shaped everything. That is how Tolkien works. The battles you haven't heard of are the ones that built the architecture of the world. Part 3. The Battle Under Stars. Fëanor is dead. He has been dead for a little while, long enough for the grief of his passing to be raw, but not yet long enough for the Noldor to have properly processed it. He crossed the grinding ice with his people. Not all of them. His half-brother, Fingolfin's people were left behind, betrayed, stranded on the wrong shore while Fëanor took the only ships. He crossed the ice, and he burned the ships at Losgar on the far shore, stranding Fingolfin in the frozen north. And then he marched on Angband before his scouts had fully assessed the ground. He died outside the gates of Angband fighting Balrogs. Multiple Balrogs. Alone because he had outrun his own soldiers in his rage, because Fëanor was always moving faster than anyone around him could match, driven by grief and fury, and the specific quality of pride that makes a person believe they are large enough to face the world's greatest evil by themselves. Gothmog the Balrog Lord killed him. His sons carried him back, and as he died his body crumbled to ash, because his spirit was so fierce that the physical form that housed it could not survive its departure. His sons have the armies now, and Morgoth, who has just discovered from the destruction of his first scouting force that the new arrivals from Valinor are more dangerous than anything Beleriand has previously offered him, sends a proper army, one of the first real armies. 40,000 orcs, we don't get the exact number from Tolkien, but the scale is clear, pouring over Eredwethrin in the dark and catching the Noldor camp at Mithrim. The Battle Under Stars, the Dagor Nuin Gileath, which translates precisely as that, should have been a massacre. The Noldor had just arrived, were grieving, were divided, were camping on unfamiliar ground in the dark. The orcs outnumbered them. What the orcs had not accounted for was that the Noldor who had walked in Valinor still carried something of the light of the two trees in their eyes. This is Tolkien being specific and mythological rather than metaphorical. These were elves who had seen the most beautiful things in the world, and that seeing had given them a quality of presence in the world. including a quality of fighting capability, a speed and a clarity of purpose that the orcs had never encountered. The first contact between these particular elves and Morgoth's armies was a complete catastrophe for the armies. The Noldor drove them back, chased the survivors north across the burning plain of Ardgallen, pursued all the way to the gates of Angband itself. Fëanor's sons had won, the first genuine elvish victory against Morgoth, and it was total. Not a single orc from that host reached Angband alive. The Noldor stood in front of the iron gates of the greatest fortress their enemy possessed, and they were victorious. And then Maedhros, Fëanor's eldest son, the one who should have been leading the host, was captured. A false parley. Messengers from Morgoth suggesting negotiations, and Maedhros came with fewer guards than he should have, and Morgoth came with Balrogs, and Maedhros was taken and hung from a cliff on Thangorodrim by his right wrist. A display, a demonstration, a message to every elf in Beleriand about what happened to those who won battles against Morgoth. He hung there for how long? Years by some accounts, until Fingolfin's people finally crossed the grinding ice, starving, frostbitten, diminished, furious. And Fingon, Fingolfin's son, who loved Maedhros despite the family betrayal at Loscar, climbed Thangorodrim with a song and an eagle and cut his cousin down. Cut him down by cutting off his hand, because Maedhros's wrist had fused with the iron it was chained to, and there was no other way. Maedhros survived. He lost his sword hand, and he survived. And the specific act of Fingon climbing that mountain, an act of love performed in the face of impossibility, performed despite the betrayal that made it almost unreasonable, healed the division between the two branches of the Noldor and made possible the alliance that held Morgoth at bay for the next 4 centuries. One small act of personal love, one young elf climbing a mountain with a song, and 400 years of relative peace became possible. The stakes of small things in Tolkien's world have always been this high. Part 4. The Siege That Nobody Remembers. Most readers of Tolkien have some awareness of the great battles. Nerneath Arnoediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, shows up in enough conversations that dedicated fans know the name. The War of Wrath, the final reckoning, is hard to miss even in summary. But the Siege of Angband, 400 years, almost half a millennium of sustained military engagement, barely registers in most discussions of the First Age, and that invisibility tells you something profound about the nature of what was happening and why it was so essential to everything that followed. After the Daegor Aglareb, the glorious battle, the third of the great battles of Beleriand, in which a Morgoth offensive was smashed on the plain in front of Angband, and the orcs were killed to the last, the Noldor and their Sindar allies pulled off something that had never been attempted in Middle-earth before. They established a military containment around Angband. Not a siege exactly, because they couldn't encircle the Iron Mountains, but a forward watch, a series of garrison positions, a network of scouts and patrols that covered every southern pass and made Morgoth's forces fight to get through. For nearly 400 years, this worked. Think about what 400 years of successful military containment means. Think about what it means for the children who grew up in Beleriand during those centuries, who had never known war, who had lived their entire lives in the sunlight and the green grass that grew even to the very doors of Angband. As Tolkien writes, "The elves don't age. The generations don't turn over the way they do in mortal cultures." But the texture of life in Beleriand changed during those 4 centuries. Cities were built. Nargothrond was carved from the stone beneath the hills. Gondolin was raised in its secret valley, the most beautiful city in the history of Middle-earth. The elves and the men who had come into Beleriand from the east made alliances, made friendships, made the specific kinds of attachment to a place and a people that make war personal when it finally arrives. That is what the siege gave Beleriand. It gave people reasons to fight, and it gave Morgoth time to plan. Tolkien writes about the siege with a specific quality of dread that builds beneath the apparent peace. The grass growing to Angband's gates, the sense of containment, of checking. But Angband is a place where the mountains are iron and the depths are enormous, and Morgoth has been alive since before the world was shaped, and a creature who measures time in ages looks at 4 centuries the way you look at a bad week. He was building, underground, in the deeps of his own fortress, dragons, larger armies, fire drakes that had not yet been seen in the world. The specific patience of someone who knows that patience is itself a weapon when the enemy cannot afford to wait forever. The men who had allied with the Noldor during the siege were mortal. They had children, and those children had children. Each generation was one generation further from the original alliance, one generation closer to the ordinary human tendency to forget why you are fighting someone you have never personally seen. Morgoth knew this. He had agents among the men, specific families who had been given gifts of gold and power in exchange for promises of treachery when the moment came. He was playing a longer game than anyone on the other side of the siege lines could comfortably comprehend. The siege ended in a single night. A winter night, when the watchers on the passes had been lulled by centuries of relative quiet into a quality of attention that was vigilant, but not quite maximally alert. The northern face of the Iron Mountains erupted. Rivers of fire came down. Dragons, led by Glaurung, the father of dragons, poured through the walls of flame. The grass of Ardgalen caught fire. The siege positions were overrun before the garrisons could organize a coordinated response. The Dagor Bragolach, the Battle of Sudden Flame. The end of the 4-century peace and the beginning of the final sequence of losses that would eventually drown Beleriand beneath the sea. Before dawn, everything that 400 years had built was in danger. Part 5. The Duel That Broke a God. In the chaos of the Dagor Bragolach, while the walls of the Noldor's northern defences collapsed and the lords of the great houses died one by one on the burning plain, something happened that Tolkien writes with such specific and controlled beauty that reading it for the first time produces a physical response in most people who love this mythology. Fingolfin, the High King of the Noldor, rode to war against Morgoth himself. Not against Morgoth's armies, against Morgoth. He rode alone to the gates of Angband, and he beat on the black gates with his bare hands, and he challenged the Valar who had become the enemy to come out and face him. Tolkien writes, "Then Fingolfin beheld, as it seemed to him, the utter ruin of the Noldor, and the defeat beyond redress of all their houses, and filled with wrath and despair he mounted upon Rochalor his great horse, and rode forth alone, and none might restrain him. He passed over the burning plain of Anfauglith, like a wind amid the dust, and all that beheld his onset fled in amaze, thinking that Oromar himself was come, for a great madness of rage was upon him, so that his eyes shone like the eyes of the Valar. Morgoth came. This is the detail that most astonishes people when they first properly absorb it. Morgoth, the greatest power walking in the physical world, came out of Angband to fight a single elf. Tolkien tells us this was the last time Morgoth ever passed the doors of his own fortress. The text adds something more extraordinary still. It is said that he took not the challenge willingly, for though his might was greatest of all things in this world, alone of the Valar he knew fear. The greatest evil in the world was afraid of one elf with a sword and a dying kingdom. The duel was one of the most unequal things in the history of Tolkien's mythology. Fingolfin was one of the greatest warriors among the Noldor, gifted and trained and fighting with everything he had. Morgoth was a Vala, a divine intelligence in physical form, wielding Grond, the hammer of the underworld. The blow of that hammer, every time it struck the ground, made pits in the earth that became lakes. Fingolfin wounded him 7 times. 7 wounds on the body of the most powerful being in the physical world. 7 times the sword, Ringil, blue and cold as winter ice, found its mark, and each time Morgoth recoiled, and each time Fingolfin came back. The elves and men who watched from far away could see the sparks rising, could hear the sound of the hammer hitting stone, could see the nimble figure of the High King dodging and coming and dodging and coming. On the 7th time, Fingolfin stumbled. His foot went into a pit the hammer had made. Morgoth pinned him to the earth. And Fingolfin, dying, used the last of what he had to drive Ringil through Morgoth's foot. Through the foot. Pinned his enemy to the ground with the same blade that had just been pinned. Morgoth limped for the rest of his existence. 7 wounds that never fully healed, because an elf in a dying kingdom had enough will to land them. Those wounds were carried by the most powerful being in the world, until the day he was thrown through the door of night into the void, a permanent testimony to what one person fighting in full knowledge of the hopelessness could accomplish. Thorondor, king of the eagles, came down from the sky. He scarred Morgoth's face with his talons, one more mark that never healed, and carried Fingolfin's body away before it could be defiled. Turgon, the king of Gondolin, raised a tomb for his father on a peak above the secret valley where his city lay hidden. Why does this matter for the Lord of the Rings? Because of what it tells you about the tradition Aragorn comes from. Because of what it tells you about the tradition Éowyn comes from. Because when you see Éowyn stand before the Witch King at the Pelennor and refuse to move, when you feel the specific quality of courage in that moment, that isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it, you are seeing the same thing Fingolfin showed, the same DNA. The same answer to the question of what you do when the situation is hopeless. You make them pay for it anyway. You make them carry the wounds of facing you for as long as they exist. That is what the First Age teaches. Part 6. The Battle of Unnumbered Tears. There are battles in Tolkien's mythology that feel like military engagements. There are battles that feel like tragedies. And there is Nanaeth Anuidiad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, which feels like the end of the world, because it was. Not the actual end of the world. Beleriand would survive for another 63 years after this battle, but the end of the realistic possibility of victory. The end of the hope that the Noldor and their allies could hold Beleriand against Morgoth through military means. The moment when the free peoples of the First Age used everything they had and found it wasn't enough. The union of Medros, the largest alliance the Noldor had ever assembled. Medros, Feanor's eldest son, the one who had lost his hand on Thangorodrim and had spent centuries learning the specific wisdom that comes from recognizing what pride costs. Medros put aside the oath that had been destroying his family, the oath to reclaim the Silmarils at any cost, and built a coalition. Not just the Noldor, the Sindar from Doriath, or at least some of them. The men of the 3 houses, Húrin and Huor leading the people of Hador, the greatest of the Edain, the men who loved the elves most and fought beside them with the most complete commitment. Dwarves from Belegost, iron-masked against the dragonfire. Even the Nandor who had sworn after their first battle never to fight again. Some of them broke that oath here for this coalition, because this was the battle they believed could end everything. The plan was good. The eastern force under Maedhros would draw Morgoth's attention and provoke him into committing his armies onto the plain. Then Fingon's western force would come around the flank in a hammer and anvil maneuver that would catch the orcs in the open and destroy them. The combined force would then march on Angband while Morgoth was exposed. It was betrayed before it started. Morgoth had spent decades buying the loyalty of specific Easterling lords. Ulfang the Black and his sons, who had come to Beleriand with their clan and sworn service to Maedhros. Gold and promises and the patient cultivation of greed and resentment across a generation. Ulfang knew the plan. Morgoth knew the plan. And Morgoth sent a provocation specifically designed to break Fingon's force before Maedhros could arrive. Gwyndor of Nargothrond was there. His brother had been captured and tortured and was now being displayed alive on the plain, outside Angband's walls, in chains, so that the army watching could see what had been done to him. Gwyndor charged. Without orders, without waiting for the signal. In pure fury, in pure grief, he led his company through the orc lines, through the gate, into the courts of Angband itself, so deep that Tolkien writes, "It is said that Morgoth trembled before the weight of the assault. They were surrounded and destroyed. Gwyndor was taken prisoner. His company died. And now Fingon had to attack early to try to save what could be saved. And the eastern force under Maedhros wasn't in position yet, and when the eastern force finally did arrive, and the battle seemed to be turning, that was when Ulfang's sons turned. The Easterlings hit Maedhros from behind. More Easterlings came out of the mountains where they had been waiting. Maedhros's force was shredded from both sides. Maglor killed Ulfang's son Uldor before dying. The loyal Easterlings who hadn't been bought fought and died protecting the flanks. None of it was enough. The Dwarves of Belegost. This is the moment in the Nirnaeth that gets cut from every summary, and that I want you to feel properly. Because while everything was falling apart, while Fingon's force was being destroyed, and Maedhros's force was disintegrating, and Glaurung the dragon was advancing across the field, burning everything in his path, the iron-masked dwarves of Belegost were the only soldiers on the field who could resist dragon fire. Their iron visors protected them. They fought in close, under the dragon's belly, and their lord Azagal drove a knife into Glaurung's belly and wounded him so badly the dragon fled the field. Azagal died doing it. Glaurung's physical response to the wound crushed him, and the dwarves, who had just lost their lord, did not break. They formed a column around his body, picked him up, and marched off the field singing a death song that Tolkien describes as so powerful that the orcs did not dare attack them. In the middle of the greatest defeat the free peoples had ever suffered, in the chaos and the fire and the breaking of everything, the dwarves of Belegost picked up their dead king and marched home singing. Nobody told you that. I needed you to know that. Fingon died. Gothmog the Balrog Lord beat him down with a whip and an axe, and white flames sprang up from his helm that was cloven. The High King of the Noldor fell in fire, and the banner of the House of Fingolfin went down with him. Then Húrin the Mortal, Lord of Harda's people, who had told Turgon before the battle that he needed to escape. Go now, Lord, while time is, for if you stand, you will perish, and with you will die all that is left of the House of Fingolfin. Yet from you and from me a new star shall arise. Turgon went. Húrin stayed. And what he did with the time he bought is one of the single most extraordinary things in the mythology. He stood at the fen of Serech with his axe, and he killed everything that came at him. Orcs and trolls. The troll's blood was caustic and burned the axe out of his hands, and he kept fighting. Tolkien writes that the battle cry, Ore Entuluva, day shall come again, was heard from him 70 times. 70 individual enemy killed while the world ended around him, crying out that the day would come again. The day did not come again. Not that day. Not for Hurin personally, who was captured alive and chained to a seat on Thangorodrim, where Morgoth cursed him to watch the destruction of everything he loved play out over the rest of his life. His children and his wife, consumed by tragedy after tragedy as the curse worked its patient way through his family. Not for decades and decades and decades, but the day did come again, thousands of years later, in a mountain in Mordor, carried by a hobbit with an axe wound to his hand, in Hurin's tradition without knowing it, fighting for something he couldn't see the end of. Day shall come again. That is the tradition. That is what the Nirnaeth builds in the bones of the free people's history. Part 7. The Fall of the City of Hidden Strength. Gondolin. You need to understand what Gondolin was before it fell, because the falling only means what it means if you understand the beauty of the thing that fell. Turgon built it in a hidden valley in the encircling mountains, kept secret from everyone outside its walls, accessible only through an underground river gorge that Turgon controlled. He had 7 gates, each one stronger than the last. He had the fountain in the central square, the white tree that was descended from the trees of Valinor, the towers with names, the Tower of the King, the Tower of the Well, the House of the Golden Flower, the House of the White Wing. He had 12 lords, each commanding their own people and their own colours, each with their own specific character and their own particular way of serving the city. Gondolin was the most completely realised, the most architecturally magnificent, the most carefully defended city in the history of Middle-earth. For 350 years it stood, through the Dagor Bragolach, through Nirnaeth Arnoediad, through all the disasters that destroyed everything else. Gondolin stood because nobody outside could find it, because Turgon had done what Thingol had done at the beginning of the age, recognized that you couldn't hold the borders, pulled inward, concentrated your strength. It fell because of a cousin. Meglin was Turgon's nephew, son of Eol the Dark Elf and Aradhel, Turgon's sister. He was gifted, enormously gifted, in the crafts of the smithy, in the underground mining that kept Gondolin supplied with ore and metal. He was politically intelligent and socially adept, and he loved Idril, Turgon's daughter, with a love that had an obsessive quality that Idril herself had always registered as threatening. He couldn't have her. She didn't want him. He was captured outside the city's secret boundaries while mining for ore. Morgoth's agents found him, and Morgoth offered him 2 things: Gondolin and Idril. The city for a report of its location, and the tunnel approaches. The woman, not as a partner, as a possession. Meglin told them everything. The assault came on Midsummer's Eve. Tolkien describes the Force, Balrogs, dragons, including the first winged dragons ever deployed, and orcs in such numbers that the light of Gondolin's fires could be seen for miles from the mountain passes. The 12 gates held for a time, and then they didn't. The lords of Gondolin died one by one. Rodge died in the outer courtyard. The Tower of the King came down with Turgon in it. Ecthelion of the Fountain fought Gothmog the Balrog Lord in the Square of the King, in the central plaza of the most beautiful city in the world, with the fountain behind him and the white tree burning, and everything he had spent his life protecting going to ash around him. He drove his helm spike through Gothmog's chest in the moment that Gothmog's whip dragged him into the fountain. They killed each other simultaneously. Ecthelion drowned with the Balrog he destroyed in the fountain of the city he gave his life to protect. Glorfindel fought a Balrog on a cliff above the refugee column in the high pass of Cirith Thorenath. Not because he had to, because the Balrog was there and the refugees were below, and someone had to stop it. He fought it out to the edge of a pinnacle of rock, and they fell together into the abyss. Tolkien describes it. They grappled, and the Balrog clutched Glorfindel's hair, and they fell, and the Balrog died of the fall, and Glorfindel died of the fall, and Thorondor came and recovered the body. And here is the piece that connects Gondolin to the Lord of the Rings, in a way that most people have never been told, because Tolkien himself wasn't sure about it for most of his life, and only confirmed it in essays he wrote near the end. The Glorfindel, who shows up at the ford of Bruinen in the Fellowship of the Ring, who puts Frodo on his horse and drives back the Nazgul with fire in his hand. That is the same Glorfindel, reincarnated in Valinor, sent back to Middle-earth in the early Third Age by the Valar. The same person who fell off a cliff in the First Age dying to protect refugees from a burning city is the same person who faces down 9 ringwraiths with Frodo's nearly dead body behind him. The elvish presence in Middle-earth during the Lord of the Rings is not just tradition, it is not just ancestry. Some of it is literally the survivors, in spirit and sometimes in body, of the First Age's wars. What the fall of Gondolin cost is almost incalculable. Every craftsman, every warrior, every architect who had been building and learning and creating in the city's 350-year protected existence, gone in a night. The fountains and the towers and the white tree, gone. Everything Turgon built from the wisdom his father's duel brought him, from the time Húrin's last stand gave him, gone. What it gave was Eärendil. Tuor and Idril escaped through the secret tunnel Idril had built years before, Meglin's treachery anticipated, and their son Eärendil eventually sailed to Valinor and made the plea that brought the Valar to Beleriand. Without the fall of Gondolin, there is no Eärendil. Without Eärendil, there is no War of Wrath. Without the War of Wrath, Morgoth stays in Angband forever, and Sauron eventually just takes the world without opposition. The losses build toward the salvation. That is Tolkien's deepest pattern. Part 8. The War that Drowned a Continent. The War of Wrath. The final war of the First Age. The largest military engagement in the history of Tolkien's world by every conceivable measure, and the one that most readers of The Lord of the Rings have the least clear picture of. Here is the scale. Morgoth's armies at the height of his power were beyond counting. His Balrogs had not yet been significantly depleted. His dragons, including for the first time the winged fire drakes that he had been building and breeding and perfecting for decades, were the most powerful weapons in the world. Angband was essentially impregnable through any combination of forces available in Middle-earth. The host of the Valar was different from anything that had ever come from Valinor. Not a peace delegation, not a limited intervention. The full martial power of the gods who had made the world, finally deciding that Morgoth's corruption of that world had gone far enough. Eönwë, the herald of Manwë, led the host. The Vanyar, the elves who had never left Valinor, who had lived in the light of the two trees their whole existence, who had never fought a real war, came in their entirety for the only time in their history. The Noldor of Valinor came. Even the Teleri, the sea elves who remembered what Feanor's people had done at Alqualonde, who had reason not to come, even they listened to Elwing, daughter of Dior, and contributed a sea force. And Eärendil, the half-elven mariner who had spent years trying to reach Valinor, whose first visit was a historical first, the first living person to set foot in the Undying Lands. whose plea before the Valar was made for both elvish and mortal peoples, asking not for his own salvation, but for help for the world he had come from. He was set in his ship in the sky with the Silmaril bound to his brow, to sail as the morning star, as a sign and a promise. The war lasted 42 years. Tolkien gives us this in the Tale of Years. F. Of 545 to 587. 42 years. The Valar's host crossed the sea and met Morgoth's armies on the burning plain of Anfauglith, where so many battles had already been fought. Tolkien writes, Anfauglith could not contain it, and all the north was aflame with war. Most of Morgoth's Balrogs were destroyed, most of his orcs. The men who had served Morgoth fought for him and were broken. Then Morgoth played his last card, the winged dragons. Led by Ankalagan the Black, the mightiest dragon ever to exist in Tolkien's world, a creature so enormous that when he finally died, his fall broke the towers of Thangorodrim, the volcanic peaks of Angband, mountains that had stood since before the first elvish waking, that had been used for 42 years in the War of Wrath as an anchor of Morgoth's defence. The dragons drove the Valar's host back. The sky over Beleriand was full of fire and storm. The battle seemed to be turning. Then Eärendil came. The morning star descending, his ship Vingilot, shining with white flame, the eagles of Manwë gathering around him. One ship and a fleet of eagles against the dragon host of Angband. The battle in the sky lasted through a full night and until the next sunrise. Before the sun rose, Eärendil killed Ankalagan, and Ankalagan fell on the towers of Thangorodrim, the mountains that had defined the northern skyline of Beleriand for the entire First Age crumbled when the dragon hit them. Morgoth was captured in the ruins of his own fortress. His feet were cut from under him, and he was bound with the chain Angainor, and cast through the door of night at the world's edge into the void. His crown was beaten into a collar for his neck. And then the consequences of 42 years of the Valar fighting a full war in the physical world made themselves clear. The continent of Beleriand sank, not through some neat, managed geological process. Through the violence of forces too large for the geography to absorb, the fighting of powers who had made the world and whose conflict literally broke the matter they had made. The rivers and the mountains and the forests and the ruins of the cities and the graves of the dead, all of it went under the water of what would become the Sundering Sea. The Blue Mountains, which had been the eastern edge of Beleriand, became the western edge of the world. The land west of them was ocean. The world that the survivors emerged into was smaller. The surviving elves of Beleriand, the remnant of every army, every city, every people who had fought and suffered and died for 600 years, gathered in Lindon at the new western shore and looked at the sea. This is the grief that the elves of Rivendell carry. This is the weight behind Galadriel's eyes. This is what Círdan the shipwright has been watching from the Grey Havens since the beginning of the Third Age. They are survivors of a civilization that was so completely destroyed that the land it stood on doesn't exist anymore. And Sauron escaped the War of Wrath. His master was gone. But Sauron survived, went back to his old habits, and began building his own empire in the ruins. Part 9. The deception of the Second Age of Middle-earth. A period so obscure in most readers' understanding of Tolkien that it might as well not exist, except for a single event everyone knows happened, the making of the Rings of Power. And even that most people understand only in its dramatic outline rather than its actual, devastating detail. Here is what actually happened and why it matters for everything in The Lord of the Rings. The elves who didn't sail west after the War of Wrath remained in Middle-earth. Some of them, including a craftsman named Celebrimbor, the grandson of Fëanor, who had inherited the family's extraordinary gift for making things, settled in Erebor, the land south of the Misty Mountains. They built a city there called Ostin Edhill, which became the most important centre of elvish craft in the Second Age. Celebrimbor was the greatest jewelsmith alive, possibly the greatest who had ever lived after Fëanor himself. Around the 1500th year of the Second Age, a stranger came to Erebor. He called himself Annatar, the Lord of Gifts. He was beautiful in the specific way that a gifted craftsman is beautiful. The beauty of someone who clearly knows how to make things, who moves with the intelligence of a maker, who looks at what you're building and asks exactly the right questions. He said he was an emissary of the Valar. He was Sauron. Gil-galad and Elrond, they refused to meet with him. They smelled the deception, the specific quality of something claiming authority it hadn't been given, using the name of the Valar as a credential without the Valar's actual endorsement. Gil-galad told Celebrimbor, "Don't trust this person." Celebrimbor trusted this person. Not because he was stupid, because Annatar was the most gifted teacher of craft he had ever encountered. And Celebrimbor was a craftsman before anything else, and the things Annatar was teaching him were things he had been trying to work out for centuries. The rings of power grew out of their collaboration. 7 for the dwarves, 9 for men, 3 for the elves, which Celebrimbor made alone, without Annatar's help, in secret. And then Sauron went to Mordor and forged the One Ring. The moment he put it on, Celebrimbor felt it. Every elf wearing a ring felt it, felt the intention behind it. The reaching through the rings they wore toward the will that could dominate all of them, the specific invasion of another's power, into the craftsmanship they believed was theirs. They took off their rings immediately. The war that followed was the War of the Elves and Sauron, and it was a disaster on a scale that most Tolkien fans have never examined in detail. Sauron's armies invaded Erebor. The city of Ostin Edhill was taken. Celebrimbor was captured. He was tortured for the locations of the rings, the 9 and the 7, which Sauron wanted. He gave those up eventually. He never gave up the 3. The 3 most powerful rings, the rings Celebrimbor had made alone, were never found by Sauron because Celebrimbor had already sent them away. Then Sauron killed him and used his body as a war banner. Celebrimbor, the greatest craftsman of the Second Age, the maker of the Rings of Power, the last of Fëanor's direct line, was killed and put on a pole and carried at the front of Sauron's advancing army as a declaration. Elrond retreated north with the survivors and founded Rivendell in S.A. 1697, a refuge, a valley, Imladris. He has been there ever since. The 3 rings went to Gil-galad, to Galadriel, to Círdan. They were used quietly, privately, to preserve, to heal, to hold back the fading that the Third Age would bring. Never as weapons, never openly. The 3 were the last act of Celebrimbor's craft, the thing he made that Sauron never got his hands on, and they sustained the elvish presence in Middle-earth for 3,000 more years. All of that history, all of that loss and craft and betrayal and survival is contained in the 3 rings visible on the fingers of Galadriel and Elrond and Gandalf in Tolkien's story. The whole Second Age's tragedy is compressed into those rings. When Frodo sees Galadriel's ring in Lorien and feels something looking back at him, he is brushing against 6,000 years of history. Part 10. The fleet that carried hope and cost. Everything, The War of the Elves and Sauron ended not with an elvish military victory, but with a fleet arriving from Numenor. And the story of that fleet is the story of why everything in the War of the Ring came down to the wire the way it did. Numenor, the island kingdom of men, raised by the valor as a reward to the Edain who had fought with the elves in Beleriand. The greatest human civilization ever to exist in Tolkien's world. Naval supremacy, military power, a lifespan 3 times the ordinary mortal span, a long relationship with the elves, a gift for language and craft, a quality of civilization that was consciously elvish in its aspirations, without being elvish in its nature. When Gil-galad sent for help as Sauron's armies swept through Erebor, Tar-Minestir of Numenor sent a fleet. The fleet arrived in SA 1700, just as Sauron was preparing to cross the Lune River and take the last elvish harbour in Middle-earth. The Númenórean soldiers drove Sauron's forces back across Erebor and down through Calenardon and across the Dagorlad to Mordor, and at the Battle of the Gwathlo, his army was broken. Sauron barely escaped with a bodyguard. Numenor saved the elves in SA 1700. Military intervention from outside arriving at the last possible moment. And this established a pattern. Numenor as the cavalry, the relief that comes when everything else is failing. That lasted for nearly 2,000 more years. And then Sauron, understanding that he couldn't beat Numenor through military force, did something that required patience so precise and manipulation so sophisticated that it is genuinely astonishing even knowing the outcome. He allowed himself to be captured, willingly, as a prisoner, brought to Numenor in chains by Ar-Pharazôn, the last king, who had brought a fleet so large that Sauron's armies simply refused to fight it. Within 50 years, Sauron was the most powerful figure in Numenor. Within a century, he had convinced Ar-Pharazôn that the Vala's prohibition on sailing to Valinor was not divine law, but territorial control. That immortality was a property of place rather than of kind, that the undying lands could be taken by force. And he convinced him to sail. The great armament. Tolkien's description is staggering. The fleet was so large that their masts were as a forest upon the mountains, and their sails like a brooding cloud. Ar-Pharazôn's flagship was called Alcarondas, Castle of the Sea. The fleet sailed west and landed on the shores of Valinor, and Ar-Pharazôn set foot on the Blessed Realm and prepared to claim immortality by conquest. Ilúvatar intervened directly. The world was changed. Valinor was removed from the circles of the world. A chasm opened in the sea. The great armament fell into it. Numenor was drowned. Ar-Pharazôn and every soldier who had landed on Valinor was buried alive in the caves of the Forgotten, waiting for the last battle and the day of doom. Tamiriel, the rightful queen who had been robbed of her throne by Ar-Pharazôn, died trying to reach the summit of the holy mountain as the sea rose around her. Sauron's body died in the destruction. His spirit went back to Mordor. He could never take a fair form again. But Elendil escaped. The faithful, the Númenóreans who had maintained the old relationships with the elves, who had disobeyed Ar-Pharazôn's ban on speaking Elvish and maintained their connection to the tradition that made Numenor great. Elendil had 9 ships ready at the eastern harbour. He and his sons Isildur and Anarion rode the wave east and were cast up on the shores of Middle-earth. They founded Gondor and Arnor, the kingdoms in exile. And the specific quality of those kingdoms, their commitment to the old alliances, their sense of themselves as heirs of something greater than what they were currently managing to be, their perpetual nostalgia for a glory that was lost. All of that comes from being founded by a man who watched his civilization drown and chose to build again rather than despair. That is what Gondor was. A rebuilt thing. A second attempt, already smaller than what came before, already carrying the weight of catastrophic loss, and it had to survive 3,000 more years of war before Aragorn could restore even a fraction of what Númenor had been. Part 11. The Last Alliance. The War of the Last Alliance. You have seen it. The prologue of Peter Jackson's Fellowship. Gil-galad and Elendil standing together. The armies marching to the Black Gate. The 7-year siege. The final battle on the slopes of Orodruin. What you haven't fully absorbed is what it cost. Gil-galad died there, burned by the heat of Sauron's hand on the slopes of the mountain. The last High King of the Noldor in Middle-earth. His line didn't continue. The High Kingship of the Noldor ended with him on Orodruin in, say, 3441, and the elves of Middle-earth never had another High King. The entire sequence of leadership that went back through Ereinion Gil-galad to Fingon and Fingolfin, and all the way to Finwë in Valinor, 6,000 years of elvish royal tradition. Gil-galad was the last of it. Elendil died there. His sword, Narsil, broke beneath him when he fell. The first king of Arna and Gondor, the man who had kept faith when his civilization drowned and built something new, dead on the slopes of the mountain, Sauron's weight crushing the life out of him. And Anarion, Elendil's second son, had already died during the 7-year siege. A stone cast from Barad-dûr, a stone from the Dark Tower, during the grinding daily reality of a siege that lasted 7 years. Anarion, who had held Osgiliath when his brother fled north during Sauron's initial assault, who had proven in the first stage of the war that Gondor could hold, killed by a stone during a siege. The Alliance won. They had to win. Isildur cut the ring from Sauron's finger. Sauron's physical form was destroyed. The armies of Mordor collapsed. They won. And the cost of winning was Gil-galad and Elendil and Anarion, and roughly a third of the Sylvan elves who had come from the Woodland Realm and Lothlorien and been destroyed at Dagorlad. Where their bodies lay in the marshes, and remained there, faces in the dead water, staring up at travellers through the murk 3,000 years later when Frodo passed by. The dead marshes. Every time Sam and Frodo look at the faces in the water on their way to Mordor, those are the soldiers of the Last Alliance. Tolkien put the war's cost directly in the path of the story's most important journey. You cannot get to Mordor without walking through the graves of everyone who tried before. Isildur kept the ring. Elrond told him to destroy it. Elrond stood at the crack of doom with Isildur and told him, and Isildur kept it. This I will have as Weregild for my father's death, and my brother's. Weregild. Compensation for a killing, a concept from Germanic lore that Tolkien knew as a scholar of the tradition. Isildur was applying a human legal framework to an object of divine corruption, and it failed in the way that all human frameworks fail when applied to things that are larger than humanity. 3 years later, orcs ambushed his column at the Gladden Fields. He put on the ring and ran for the Anduin and swam, and the ring betrayed him. Slipped from his finger in the cold water, made him visible to the orc archers on the bank, shot through the throat and heart. The ring lay in the river for 2,400 years, and Gondor and Arna were left to manage alone. Part 12. The kingdom that tore itself apart. The Kinstrife. In Tea. 1432, Gondor destroyed itself from within, and the wound it made never fully healed, not by the War of the Ring, not in the Fourth Age, not in anything Tolkien wrote about what came after. Here is the genealogy of catastrophe. Valakar, king of Gondor, had been sent north as an ambassador to the Northmen of Rhovanion. He fell in love with a Northman princess named Vidumavi and married her. Their son, Eldakar, was half Northman, half Dúnedain. The southern nobles, particularly in Pelaga and Umbar, where the highest status pure Númenórean blood lived, refused to accept a half-blood king. It wasn't immediately violent. The resentment built for years during Eldakar's early reign organized itself around a captain named Castamir, the admiral of Gondor's fleet, who had a tenuous blood claim to the throne and the support of every noble family that had decided the purity question was the hill they would die on. In 1437, 5 years after the formal disputes began, civil war erupted. Osgiliath was besieged. Gondor's greatest city, the city that straddled the Anduin, the city with the great dome that housed one of the Palantiri. Osgiliath was fought over by 2 Gondorian armies, and in the course of the siege the dome was destroyed, and the Palantir fell into the Anduin. Gone. Thousands of years of accumulated human knowledge and history and cultural significance, a city that had stood since the founding of Gondor, damaged beyond recovery in a civil war over whether the king was pure enough. Castamir captured Ornandil, Eldakar's eldest son, and had him killed. Not killed in battle. Executed, as a statement. As a demonstration of what pure contempt for the opposing side looked like when it had the power to express itself without consequence. Eldakar fled. For 10 years, Castamir ruled, and his rule was exactly what you would expect from someone whose primary qualification was racial hatred. Cruel, strategically narrow, obsessed with his naval power base at Pelagia, at the expense of the inland provinces that made Gondor a kingdom rather than a coastal empire. The people he ruled despised him. The northern and central provinces waited. Eldakar came back in 1447 with a Northman army and every disaffected noble who had watched Castamir's rule and decided the civil war had been a mistake. At the Battle of the Crossings of Erui, he killed Castamir personally in single combat. That's it. That's the end of the usurpation. Except it wasn't. Castamir's sons held Pelagia and the fleet for a year, then escaped to Umbar, the great southern haven that Gondor had controlled and built up for centuries. They took most of the fleet with them. The entire naval supremacy of Gondor sailed south with the sons of Castamir and never came back. The Corsairs of Umbar. The rebel fleet becomes the founding of the most persistent thorn in Gondor's side for the rest of the Third Age. The descendants of Castamir raid Gondor's coasts for centuries. In TA 1634, they sail up the Anduin and sack Pelagia and kill King Menadil. In 2746, they kill a prince of Dol Amroth. In 2758, when Rohan is fighting a massive Dunlending invasion, and the whole Western Alliance is stretched to breaking, 5 Corsair fleets attack Gondor simultaneously. And in TA 3019, during the War of the Ring, the Corsair fleet sails up the Anduin toward the Pelennor, while Theoden is charging and Minas Tirith is burning. The fleet that appears out of the south in those crucial hours, the ships that Aragorn takes with the army of the dead, the black sails that come around the bend of the Anduin, and are recognized by the defenders as Corsairs before the banners change. That is the direct lineal descendant of the ships Castamir's sons stole when they fled Gondor in 1448. 1 civil war. 600 years of consequences, leading all the way to the most important battle of the Third Age. Part 13. The war that almost prevented Aragorn's existence. In the Third Age, around the year 1300, a new realm appeared in the far north. On the other side of the misty mountains from what remained of Arnor, in the cold iron country where few people lived, and no power had bothered to maintain a presence, something called itself Angmar, and started building armies. The being who ruled Angmar was not announced. He came with cold and shadow and a specific quality of strategic intelligence that wasn't random violence. He began attacking the fragmented successor kingdoms of Arnor, Arthedain in the northwest, Cardolan in the south, Rudor in the east, with a methodical patience that felt less like conquest and more like erosion. Not trying to win in a single campaign, trying to destroy the possibility of the enemy recovering. We know now who it was. The Witch King of Angmar, the Lord of the Nazgul, Sauron's most powerful servant, sent north with a specific mission that can only be appreciated when you understand the deeper strategy. The heir of Isildur represented the only blood claim that could legitimately reunite Gondor and Arnor and restore the full strength of the Dunedain. The Rangers of the North, the depleted remnant of Arnor's Dunedain, were the specific bloodline that needed to be eliminated. Aragorn exists as a possibility because the Witch King failed to eliminate it. The Angmar War lasted in various phases nearly 700 years. TA 1300 to 1975. 7 centuries of grinding war against a kingdom that had already been weakened by internal division and centuries of slow population decline. In 1409, the Witch King launched a major offensive. Weathertop, Amansul, the hill where Frodo would be stabbed 2,500 years later, was burned. The tower was destroyed. The Palantir of Amon Sul, one of the 3 northern seeing stones, was lost. King Argaleb I was killed. The elves of Lindon and Rivendell came and pushed the Witch King back, saved what was left. But the respite was temporary. Cardolan, the southern kingdom, was devastated in the same assault. When the Great Plague hit in 1636, it finished what the Witch King had started. The last surviving Dunedain of Cardolan died. Angmar sent Barrow-wights to occupy the empty burial mounds of the Cardolan nobility. The Barrow Downs, where the hobbits nearly died on their way to Bree, are a direct consequence of this specific phase of the Angmar War. In 1974, the Witch King launched his final campaign. Fornost, the last city of Arthedain, fell. The last king of Arthedain, Arvedui, his name means last king, and Tolkien named him that deliberately, fled north to the Ice Bay of Forochel with the last of the northern Palantiri. A Lossoth chieftain warned him not to board the ship Círdan sent. He boarded anyway. The ship sank. Arvedui drowned. Both remaining northern Palantiri went to the bottom of the sea. The North Kingdom was gone. Arnor, the sister kingdom of Gondor, the realm Elendil himself had founded. Gone. Not conquered and occupied. Simply gone, its people scattered, its cities empty, its land returned to wilderness. The Battle of Fornost in 1975 was the revenge. Erebor of Gondor arrived with a fleet and an army and met the Witch King's forces on the plain north of the empty city, with Glorfindel's force from Rivendell and the remnant Dunedain from Arthedain, and a company of hobbit archers from the Shire. The Witch King's army was destroyed. Angmar was broken. Angmar. As the Witch King fled, Erna tried to pursue him. Glorfindel physically stopped him. And then Glorfindel said something that had been waiting, it turned out, almost 3,000 years to be properly understood. Do not pursue him. He will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall. Not by the hand of man. The prophecy that Éowyn fulfilled in TA 3019, 2,500 years later, stabbing the Lord of the Nazgul through the face, while Merry drove an enchanted blade through his leg. Not by the hand of man. Because Éowyn was not a man, and Merry was not a man, and the prophecy was always more precise than it sounded. But here is the cost the Angmar War left behind that most people miss. Eärnur, furious at being stopped, did not pursue the Witch King at Fornost. But in T 2050, when he was king of Gondor, the Witch King sent him a personal challenge, taunting him for the cowardice of Fornost, and Eärnur rode to Minas Morgul to answer it, alone, against all advice, against the voice of his steward and his council and everyone who could see what was obviously happening. He was never seen again. The line of Anarion ended with him. The last king of Gondor in the canonical steward period, the end of the royal line that had run from Anarion and Meneldyl all the way down through 26 generations. Gone because the Witch King goaded him into riding to his death. After Eärnur, the stewards ruled. For nearly 1,000 years, the steward's crook instead of the king's scepter, power held in trust for a king who never came, until Aragorn showed up. The Angmar War didn't just destroy Arnor. It destroyed Gondor's royal line by eliminating the one who should have inherited the responsibility of keeping it. 2 kingdoms for the price of 1 extended campaign and a very carefully placed personal insult. Part 14. The wars that were supposed to happen at the same time. Here is something about Sauron's strategic thinking that becomes clear only when you look at the whole sweep of Third Age history, and that most people never see because they're looking at events individually rather than simultaneously. Between TA 1851 and 1944, Gondor was fighting a series of wars against a people called the Wainriders. Easterling peoples from Rhûn, almost certainly organized by Sauron's agents, who used great war chariots and cavalry to attack Gondor from the east across 3 generations. And during the same period, the Witch King was pressing the Angmar War in the north, attacking Arthedain with increasing force. Look at the timing. Gondor, fighting the Wainriders in the east, cannot send troops north to help Arthedain. Arthedain, fighting Angmar in the north, cannot send anything south to reinforce Gondor against the Wainriders. Both kingdoms, simultaneously strained by enemies attacking from completely different directions, are unable to help each other. Not by coincidence, by design. Sauron was running coordinated campaigns against both Dunedain kingdoms from 2 completely different fronts. At distances so large and in periods before rapid communication that it was nearly impossible for the kingdoms under attack to recognize the coordination, let alone respond to it. 2-front war conducted by a single intelligence operating through proxy armies on opposite ends of the map, and it almost worked perfectly. In TA 1944, the Wainriders and their southern allies in Harad and Khand launched their most ambitious offensive. King Onderhair of Gondor rode north to face the Wainriders and was killed. His son, Artemir, was killed with him. His other son, Faramir, who had disguised himself to ride with the cavalry against his father's orders, was killed in the fighting. Gondor lost the king and both legitimate heirs in a single campaign. It was saved by a general named Eärnil, who had defeated the southern allies in a separate engagement, heard of the disaster at the Morannon, and led a forced march back to catch the Wainriders celebrating their victory over Onderhair in their camp. He attacked at dawn while they were still feasting. The Battle of the Camp. The Wainriders, who believed they had won the war, were annihilated in their moment of celebration. Gondor survived, but the line of kings was broken in that generation. Eärnil became king, but the blood claim was thin, and the question of succession was contested, and the line that ran forward from Eärnil eventually produced Eärnur, the king who rode to Minas Morgul and died, and ended the line entirely. One coordinated 2-front campaign in the mid-Third Age, and it was the blow that set up everything that followed. The absence of a northern king. the end of Gondor's southern royal line, the thousand-year stewardship, and a world that by the War of the Ring had no legitimate human king, except for the one ranger living in the wilderness who hadn't told anyone who he was yet. Part 15. The night Gondor set fire to its own navy. We have talked about what the kin strife cost Gondor in terms of its fleet. Now let us talk about what almost came back. In TA 1810, King Telumeitar of Gondor conducted one of the most dramatically satisfying campaigns in the entire Third Age. He retook Umbar by storm, captured the havens, and killed the last direct descendants of Castamir, who had been ruling the Corsair state. He took the title Umbar-Dashil, conqueror of Umbar, and the haven was Gondor's again for the first time in nearly 4 centuries. Gondor held Umbar for less than 2 centuries. The Haradrim, who had been steadily growing stronger under Sauron's indirect influence, took it back in the chaos that followed the Wainrider Wars. And Umbar, as a Corsair state allied with Harad, became something more dangerous than it had been before. Not just rebellious Gondorian nobles nursing a grievance, but a full geopolitical rival with the backing of Sauron's southern networks. The next 300 years of the Corsair Wars are a grinding story of raid and counter-raid, fleet actions, coastal attacks, and the slow attrition of Gondor's naval capacity against an enemy that could always rebuild because Harad's population was vast, and the Corsairs' institutional knowledge of seamanship was among the best in the world. In Tia 2980, 39 years before the War of the Ring, a young captain serving under Denethor's father, Ecthelion II, led a surprise raid on the Corsair harbour at Umbar, at night with a small force. The raid burned the Corsair fleet at anchor, killed the admiral of the haven in single combat, and withdrew before a defence could be organised. Ecthelion gave this captain the title Thorongil, Eagle of the Star, and praised him publicly. Thorongil was Aragorn, working undercover in Gondor's service, doing the work that needed doing before he was ready to announce who he was. The raid on Umbar in 2980 is Aragorn's first major military action in his own story, conducted in disguise against an enemy that would come back to threaten Gondor in the very war for which he was ultimately preparing. At the Pelennor Fields, when the black ships come around the bend of the Anduin and the defenders of Minas Tirith think it is the Corsairs arriving to finish them. And then the banners change and Aragorn steps onto the shore with the army of the dead. That moment of recognition, that pivot from despair to hope, is built on 39 years of strategic preparation. He burned their fleet at Umbar to buy time. He used the army of the dead to destroy their surviving fleet at the moment the war needed the ships more than the Corsairs did. The Corsair threat that began with the Kinstrife in 1437 was finally resolved in 3019 by the heir of Isildur, who had spent his entire adult life understanding every dimension of the problem. That is what a heritage of 6,000 years of war teaches someone. Not despair. How to solve the problems that previous generations couldn't solve, using tools they built and didn't know they were building. Part 16. The battle that created Rohan. Tea 2510. The Field of Celebrant. And everything you feel about Rohan in The Lord of the Rings. The charge at dawn, the horns in the distance. Theoden King rides now to ruin and the world's ending. It all starts here in a battle that's almost never discussed. Gondor under Steward Sirion was fighting a war on 2 fronts. The Balchoth, a new wave of Easterlings, bigger and better organized than most of their predecessors, were invading from the northeast, crossing the River Limelight into the Gondorian province of Calenardhon. Meanwhile, orcs from the Misty Mountains were raiding from the west. Sirion's army was caught between both forces and driven back across the Limelight to the Field of Celebrant, with the Anduin behind them. He had sent for help. 6 riders. To the Eotheod, the Northmen who lived in the upper vales of the Anduin, descendants of the same Northman culture that Valakar had married into, and that had caused the kin strife. Only one rider got through. Borondir Udalraf, Borondir the Stirrupless, rode 500 miles in days on a dying horse to reach Eorl the Young, king of the Eotheod. Eorl came, with 7,000 fully armed riders and his best cavalry archers. He rode 500 miles south at military speed. How he was not detected by Sauron's intelligence networks, how he got that army to the field of Celebrant without being intercepted, Tolkien implies that a mist from Lorien, some intervention of Galadriel's, covered their approach. Whether or not that specific detail is canonical, the effect is. The Rohirrim arrived on the battlefield completely undetected and struck the Balcoth's rear with their full cavalry force at the moment when Gondor's line was about to break. The Battle of the Field of Celebrant was over in hours. The Balcoth were broken and driven into the river. The Orc raiders caught between 2 enemies were destroyed. Sirion gave Eorl Calenardhon, the entire province, vast, empty, fertile, exactly the kind of country a horse culture needed to become what it could be. And over the tomb of Elendil himself, on a hill called Amun Anwar, the sacred hill that had been kept secret since the founding of Gondor, Eorl swore the Oath of Eorl. In Tolkien's account, the oath was so solemn that it was spoken in Quenya, a language Eorl didn't even understand, offered by Sirion in the oldest and most formal of the Elvish tongues, because the moment demanded the most complete seriousness available. Their enemies shall be our enemies, their need shall be our need, and whatsoever evil or threat or assault may come upon them, we will aid them to the utmost end of our strength. The Eotheod settled in Calenardon. They became the Rohirrim. Eorl's son Brago built Edoras. His grandson completed the Golden Hall of Meduseld. The entire Rohan that Tolkien describes in the 2 towers, Theoden and Eomer, and Eowyn and the riders and the long plains and the horse culture. All of it is 500 years old at the time of the War of the Ring. It started with a single rider getting through to deliver a message and a cavalry charge that arrived at the last possible moment. And the beacon system, those great signal fires on the peaks of the White Mountains that Pippin lights in The Return of the King, the fires that bring the Rohirrim to the Pelennor, those were built specifically to maintain the alliance, to give Gondor a way to call Rohan that couldn't be intercepted or blocked. Built by the specific knowledge that the next time Gondor needed Rohan, there might not be 6 riders to send and only 1 getting through. The people who built those beacons had studied what the Field of Celebrant almost cost. They built the system to make sure it couldn't happen again. Part 17, The War That Built, Thorin Oakenshield. Tier 2793. A 70-year-old dwarf named Thror decided to revisit Moria, alone, against his son's advice, against all reasonable strategic assessment. Alone because the mining rights he believed he still had to the mithril seams of Khazad Dûm were a matter of principle, and Thror was the kind of person for whom principle was more compelling than survival. The Orc chieftain of Moria was named Azog. He was pale, enormous, and had built a fiefdom in the mountain on the foundation of the dwarves' absence from it. He captured Thror, beheaded him, branded his own name in runes on the severed head, and sent it back to Thror's companion Nar, along with a handful of small coins, and the message that he was the new master of Moria, and could pay wages to anyone who wanted to work for him. Thror's son Thrain spent 3 years gathering the response. He sent messengers to all 7 houses of the dwarves. He explained what had been done to his father, what had been done to his people, what the orcs of the Misty Mountains had been doing across generations. And the Seven Houses came. The wars of the dwarves and orcs lasted 6 years, from TA 2793 to 2799. The dwarves moved south from Mount Gundabad, systematically attacking every orc stronghold in the Misty Mountains, clearing the range from north to south. The orcs fought back. Every siege, every ambush, every desperate stand in a mountain pass. And the dwarves, who have never been casual about the things they believe are worth fighting for, prosecuted this war with a thoroughness that became legendary. The final battle was at Azanul-Bizar, Nanduhirion in Sindarin, the valley below the east gate of Moria, with the Mirror at its floor. The dwarves arrived in winter, no sun, bare trees, the grey light of a mountain, December. The first assault was thrown back. Frerin, Thrain's younger son, Thorin's brother, was killed in the initial fighting near the Mirror. Fundin fell there too. Fundin was the father of Balin and Dwalin. Balin, who would later lead the ill-fated expedition to reclaim Moria and whose tomb the Fellowship reads from. Dwalin, who would be among Thorin's company in The Hobbit. They grew up without their father because Fundin died at Azanul-Bizar in the first assault. 9 of the Iron Hills arrived with reinforcements and counterattacked. He fought his way to the east gate of Moria itself and challenged Azog to single combat. Azog dodged Nine's swing. Nine had been fighting for hours, his arm was tired, and snapped his neck. Thorin's shield was destroyed in the fighting. He cut a branch from an oak tree in the valley, a branch Tolkien says that he used as a shield and buckler for the rest of the day. And the name Oakenshield is not a title someone gave him after the fact. It is the description of what he was carrying when he held the centre of the dwarven line with 9 dead and his own people breaking. He held it. The battle turned. The orcs fled toward the east gate. Dane Ironfoot, Nine's son, was 32 years old, very young for a dwarf. He sprinted up the stairs after Azog and killed him on the threshold of the gate, cut off his head and stuffed the coin purse Azog had thrown at Nar into his mouth, and put the head on a spike. Thrain wanted to go in, reclaim Moria, march the army through the gate and take back what had been taken, and Dain stopped him, had to physically intervene. Because Dain had been the first dwarf to look through the open east gate of Moria in generations, and what he had seen there, in the deep dark beyond the threshold, had done something to him that he never properly described. He said in the brief account that survives, "I have looked through the shadow of the gate. Beyond the shadow, it waits for you still. Durin's bane. The world must change and some other power than ours must come before Durin's folk walk again. In Moria." He had seen the Balrog, the same Balrog that Gandalf would fight a quarter-century before the War of the Ring. The same Balrog that was still there, still awake after being disturbed by Durin the Sixth's miners centuries before, still burning in the dark, below the mithril seams. Dain refused to go in. Thrain eventually accepted the decision. The dwarves buried their dead and dispersed. And Thorin Oakenshield spent the next decades as a homeless wanderer, driven from the Blue Mountains where his people had scraped together an existence after losing Erebor, watching his father eventually captured by Sauron's agents and driven mad, carrying the last of the dwarf rings in a fortress dungeon, and eventually dying. By the time Gandalf found Thorin in the Prancing Pony in Bree, Thorin was carrying 60 years of accumulated humiliation and loss, and the specific burning quality of someone who has been waiting too long for permission to try to reclaim something. The Hobbit starts because of Azanul-Bizar. The finding of the ring starts because of the Hobbit. The War of the Ring starts because of the finding of the ring. Part 18. The war happening during the Fellowship. While Frodo is walking from the Shire to Rivendell to Lothlorien, to the breaking of the Fellowship. While the story you know is unfolding in its intimate, personal drama of 9 companions against the world, there is a war happening that the story barely acknowledges. Lorien is being attacked multiple times, while Galadriel is meeting Frodo and Sam and giving them the gifts that will matter later, and showing Frodo the mirror. While all of that is happening, the forces of Dol Guldur are assaulting the forest from outside. 3 times during the War of the Ring, Sauron sends armies against Lothlorien. 3 full military assaults against the most powerfully defended Elvish realm still in Middle-earth. Galadriel and Celeborn defend the forest, and they hold, and Nenya, the Ring of Water, Celebrimbor's last great work before Sauron tortured him to death, sustains the defense. The people being killed in those assaults while you watch Frodo look at his reflection in the mirror are never named. Their stories are never told in the main narrative. They are simply soldiers of the Golden Wood, defending something they believe is worth defending. They are dying so that the Fellowship can rest in Lothlorien and receive their gifts and continue south toward Rhoros. At the same time, Thranduil's woodland realm in northern Mirkwood is also under assault. Multiple attacks from Dol Guldur, from the orc forces Sauron deploys north, while his main armies move south toward Gondor. Thranduil holds, his people hold. At the Battle of Dale in the north, the combined dwarves of Erebor under Dain Ironfoot. The same Dain who refused to enter Moria, now elderly and enormous and still fighting. And the men of Dale under King Brand fight a desperate engagement against a massive Easterling host. Both Dain and Brand die in that battle. Dain dies cutting down enemies over the body of Brand, his friend, old and grey but still fighting, still Oakenshield's cousin, still the Iron Hills' pride. Erebor is besieged. The survivors of Dale fight their way into the mountain and hold out behind the dwarven defences. They are still holding when news of the ring's destruction comes, and the Easterling army, suddenly leaderless and without purpose, dissolves. These battles are the northern front of the War of the Ring. They are preventing Sauron from using his northern armies to reinforce the Pelennor, from sweeping down the Anduin Valley, from closing the trap from above. They are buying the story you're watching time to reach its conclusion. Tolkien mentions them in appendices and passing references. They are not dramatized. They are not named battles in the main narrative. They are simply the background noise of a world at war, the cost being paid by people who will never be central characters in the story you're reading. This is one of the deepest things about Tolkien's world. Every time someone in The Lord of the Rings does something heroic, somewhere off-screen someone else is paying the cost that makes the heroism possible. Every quiet scene has a battle behind it. Every gift has a death behind it. The world is larger than the story, and the story keeps telling you to look at what you're not looking at. Part 19. What all of it was protecting. Let us pull back now. Let us hold the whole sweep of what we've covered tonight and feel the shape of it. First, Battle of Beleriand. Denethor dies. The Nandor swear off warfare forever. Thingol builds the girdle that defines the whole geography of First Age politics. Dagor Nuin Gileath. The Noldor arrive and win. But Maedhros is taken and hung on a cliff for years, establishing from the first engagement that Morgoth's response to defeat is to make the victory cost more than the winning. The Siege. 4 centuries of containment that give the elves the civilization they'll mourn for the rest of history, while Morgoth builds the weapons that will end it. Dagor Bragolach. The siege ends in fire. Fingolfin duels Morgoth alone because he will not watch his kingdom fall without being paid for, wounds the greatest evil in the world 7 times, and pins his foot to the ground, dying. Nanaeth Arnoediad. The largest alliance ever assembled. Betrayed from within. The dwarves of Belegost saving the retreat. Hurin shouting that the day will come again 70 times as he's being taken prisoner. The Hill of Tears, raised on the battlefield where grass will not grow. Fall of Gondolin. Ecthelion and Gothmog, dying simultaneously in a fountain. Glorfindel falling off a cliff to protect refugees, the last beautiful city gone, but Eärendil escaping in the secret tunnel. War of Wrath. The gods come, 42 years. Ankalagan the Black and Eärendil in the sky. The dragon falling on mountains and breaking them. Morgoth in chains, Beleriand under the sea. War of the Elves and Sauron. Celebrimbor tortured and used as a banner. Rivendell founded the 3 rings hidden. Downfall of Numenor. The greatest human civilization drowned, the world bent. Sauron's fair form destroyed forever. Elendil escaping with 9 ships and the shards of Narsil. Last alliance, Gil-galad and Elendil and Anarion dying. Isildur keeping the ring lost at the Gladden Fields. Kinstrife, Gondor's fleet stolen, the corsairs of Umbar born, the royal bloodline diluted. Angmar War, Arnor destroyed, the Witch King prophesied, Ernor lured to his death, the stewardship beginning. Wainrider Wars, coordinated campaigns on 2 fronts. Gondor losing its king and both heirs, almost ending before the War of the Ring even starts. Field of Celebrant, Rohan created, the Oath of All sworn, the beacon system built. Battle of Azanul Bizarre, Thorin Oakenshield named, the Hobbit made possible, the ring found. Wars against Lorien and Dale and the Woodland Realm, fought simultaneously with everything you watch in The Lord of the Rings, by people you never meet, dying so that the story can continue. Now look at what Frodo walks into. He walks into the last intact remnant of everything that survived all of that. The Shire, protected by Aragorn's rangers for generations, is the remnant of the northern Dunedain's domain. Rivendell is Elrond's refuge, built in the crisis of the War of the Elves and Sauron, sustained for 3,000 years. Lothlorien is held together by Nenya, the ring of the woman who watched Beleriand drown. Gondor is Elendil's rebuilt thing, already smaller than what came before, held by a steward because the royal line ended. Rohan is 500 years old. The rangers who protect the Shire without the Shire knowing it are the last biological remnant of Arna. And Sauron, looking at all of this from Barad-dûr, Sauron, who has been present for most of these events, who has been either causing them or benefiting from them across 6,000 years of history, Sauron looks at this last remnant and sees something that anyone in Mordor's planning department would have told him. The free peoples are on their last reserves. The numbers are smaller than they've ever been. The kingdoms are weaker than they've ever been. The alliances are holding by threads. If there was ever a moment to apply the final pressure, this is it. He's right. Strategically, materially, militarily, he's right. This is the correct moment. He will probably never have a better one. And he still almost loses, because what the free peoples have that doesn't appear on any strategic assessment is this. They have earned the right to fight for what they love by having fought for it this many times before. The quality of courage in the free peoples of Middle-earth at the War of the Ring is not the courage of people who have never known defeat. It is the courage of people who have known defeat in every possible form and who keep fighting anyway because the specific things they are protecting are worth it. Elrond at Rivendell has watched civilizations fall. He knows what it looks like. He can calculate the odds. He still hosts the council. He still sends his sons south with Aragorn. He still gives Aragorn the shards of Narsil to be reforged. Galadriel could have taken the ring from Frodo. She wanted to. She told him she wanted to. She turned it down because she understood. From 6,000 years of watching what power does to the people who hold it, that the ring was not a solution, was never a solution, would always become the problem. Aragorn spent 87 years in the wilderness preparing for a moment he wasn't certain would come. Not because he was guaranteed success, because the line of Isildur, if it existed at all, had an obligation to be present for the attempt. This is what the Hidden Wars built. Not invincibility, not certain victory. The character to attempt what needs to be attempted in full knowledge of what failure looks like, because the people who came before demonstrated that the attempt matters even when it fails. Especially when it fails. The attempt itself is the statement that the thing you're protecting is real and worth protecting, and will not be quietly surrendered. Part 20. Glorfindel at the Ford. One more moment, one more connection between the Hidden Wars and the story you know. The Ford of Bruinen. Frodo with the Morgul wound, weakening, barely able to stay on the white horse. The Nazgul on the bank. 9 of them, the full complement of the Witch King's force, waiting for him to cross the river to their side or fall into their hands. And Glorfindel rides out. Glorfindel, who died on a cliff in the First Age protecting refugees from a burning city. Glorfindel, who was reincarnated in Valinor because what he had done mattered enough that the Valar couldn't simply let it end there. Glorfindel, who prophesied at Fornost that the Witch King would not fall by the hand of man, and was right about it, 2,500 years before the prophecy was fulfilled. He rides toward the Nazgul, and fire is in his hand. The Nazgul hesitate. 9 ringwraiths, the most feared creatures in Middle-earth during the War of the Ring, and they hesitate. Because Glorfindel is the only elvish warrior in Middle-earth who has personally killed a Balrog. Because whatever it is that the Nazgul perceive about him, the quality of a being who has died in heroic sacrifice and been returned specifically for the work that needs doing, is something they are not equipped to simply brush aside. Frodo makes it across. The flood takes the ringwraiths. The crisis passes. That moment, that single moment at the Ford of Bruinen, required Fingolfin to wound Morgoth 7 times. Required Húrin to stand at the fen of Serech and die 70 times dying. Required the dwarves of Belegost to march off a burning battlefield, singing around their lord's body. Required Ecthelion to drown in a fountain with the Balrog lord he killed. Required Glorfindel himself to fall off a cliff protecting the survivors of Gondolin. Required 3,000 years of elvish survival in Middle-earth, while all these other wars ground everything down. It required all of that for Glorfindel to be at the Ford of Bruinen on that specific night with that specific frail hobbit on that specific horse. For one moment of fire in an outstretched hand that bought the story the time it needed. Nothing in this world is wasted. Not a battle, not a death, not a wound. Not Fingolfin's limp, not Húrin's cry, not the iron masks of the dwarves of Belegost, not Ecthelion drowning in the fountain, not Glorfindel falling. Nothing. Wasted. Part 21. The day that came again. Húrin shouted it 70 times as he was being taken prisoner on the worst battlefield of the First Age. Ora Entuluva. Day shall come again. He did not see the day come. He spent the rest of his mortal life watching his son die in tragedy, and his daughter die in grief, and everything he loved consumed by Morgoth's curse. He lived long enough to see the First Age end. He did not live to see the War of the Ring. But the day came. It came through Glorfindel at the Ford. through Theoden riding to ruin and the world's ending, through Éowyn standing over the Witch King and saying, "I am no man," through the army of the dead released from their oath at last, through two hobbits on a mountain in a world of ash, one of them carried on the other's back, heading toward a fire they might not survive, through Gollum dancing on the edge, through the long chain of small mercies and specific loyalties and personal loves that the eye could not see and could not account for and could not predict or prevent. The day came, not as a permanent condition. Tolkien's world is not a world of permanent resolution, and the fourth age he describes has its own difficulties ahead. But in the specific moment when the ring hit the fire, and the eye closed and Barad-dûr fell, and the Nazgûl dissolved into screaming shadows over the Pelennor, and Mordor's army collapsed into chaos. In that moment, the day that Húrin called for in the ruins of Nirnaeth Arnoediad 3,000 years earlier was real. Not forever. Real. This is what the hidden wars outside the Lord of the Rings are ultimately for. Not background, not world-building detail, not the kind of supplementary material that the dedicated fan reads for completeness. They are the argument. They are what Tolkien was building when he built the mythology that the Lord of the Rings sits on top of. The argument is this: the darkness is real. It is old and patient and capable of outlasting any single person's hope, or any single generation's endurance, or any single civilization's best efforts. It has been doing this since before the sun rose for the first time, and it is very, very good at it. Every kingdom that ever stood against it has eventually been broken or drowned or dispersed, and it still has not won, because every time it breaks something, some small number of people pick up whatever can be carried and build something else in the ruins. Because Thingol pulled Melion's border inward rather than breaking under the first assault. Because Fingolfin went to the gates of Angband rather than dying in a ditch. Because Húrin cried out that the day would come, rather than going silently. Because Ecthelion died with the Balrog rather than running. Because Glorfindel fell off the cliff rather than watching the refugees die. Because a hobbit said yes when Gandalf asked. Because a gardener's son said, "Wherever you go, I go." The darkness is real. It has always been real. It has been in this world since Morgoth first introduced discord into the music of creation, and it will be in this world until the last battle remakes everything. And it has never been able to close the story, because the small things keep happening. The mercies that don't calculate, the loyalties that don't expire, the specific individual human refusal to accept that the thing worth protecting isn't worth protecting anymore. That's the argument. 6,000 years of war and loss and the rebuilding of broken things and the small acts that changed everything even when the people performing them couldn't see how. That's what's outside the Lord of the Rings. That's what the story stands on. When you watch Aragorn stand at the Black Gate and tell his soldiers the truth about what they're facing and give them permission to leave, remember, every person who stayed is the heir of someone who stayed before them, going back further than any of them know. Going back to a hillside called Amon Ereb, where a lord of the Nandor died in the dark, before the sun had risen for the first time. Day shall come again. It always has. Part 22. What Tolkien was building all along. Before we end tonight, I want to say something plainly about what Tolkien was doing when he built this mythology. Not just the myths themselves, the relationship between the myths and the story. Why the hidden wars matter for the Lord of the Rings beyond the historical context they provide. Tolkien was an Anglo-Saxon scholar. He spent his professional life studying languages and literatures that came from a Northern European tradition that understood the world in a very specific way. As a place where darkness was real, defeat was common, And courage was meaningful precisely because victory was not guaranteed. The Norse and Anglo-Saxon tradition that produced Beowulf and the Elder Edda was not a tradition of triumph. It was a tradition of holding, of resisting, of making the darkness pay as much as possible for every inch. Tolkien loved this tradition. He found in it something that more modern literature often lacked: the honesty of acknowledging that the darkness is not going to be beaten by cleverness alone, that there are enemies which outlast any single human lifespan, that the project of civilization is not a problem to be solved once, but a commitment to be renewed by every generation. What he built in the hidden wars of Middle-earth's history is that tradition made explicit. Every one of the battles we've discussed tonight embodies the northern courage. Not the courage that is certain of victory, but the courage that chooses to fight because the cause is right, regardless of the probability of success. Fingolfin going to Angband, Húrin at the fen of Serech, Ecthelion in the fountain, the dwarves of Belagost marching home singing. And then he showed you what that tradition produces. Over 6,000 years of accumulated application, it produces Frodo. Not a warrior, not a king, not a wizard or an elf or a Dunedain ranger with a secret destiny. A hobbit from the Shire who doesn't want to be doing this, who carries the ring not because he is strong enough to resist it, but because he is humble enough to know he can't use it, and just enough to understand why it needs to be destroyed. All of Beleriand's wars, all of the Second Age's catastrophes, all of the Third Age's grinding attritional defeats. They led through the specific chain of cause and consequence that Tolkien built with such precision, to a moment where the most important act in the history of the world was performed by the person least likely to perform it, the smallest person, the most ordinary person, the one the eye didn't bother to track because he didn't matter. The hidden wars built the world that needed a Frodo, the world that was too depleted for any of its conventional heroes to save it, the world where the only option left was the option that the darkness couldn't see. An act of pure will from someone with nothing to gain and everything to lose, carried up a mountain by a friend who refused to leave him. This is why the history matters. Not to fill in the background, to explain why the foreground is what it is, why the councils and the kings and the armies were necessary but not sufficient. Why the small people were necessary in the specific way that small people become necessary when everything large has failed. Tolkien didn't invent Frodo despite the history. He invented Frodo because of it. Dwarves, Part 23. The final accounting. Let us count what it cost. Beleriand, a subcontinent under the ocean. The blue mountains that form the western edge of Middle-earth in The Lord of the Rings are the eastern edge of what used to exist. Everything west of them is gone. Every forest, every river, every city, every road, every grave, every tree that ever grew in Fingolfin's kingdom, or Turgon's valley, or the land of Doriath, where Luthien danced, under the water. The elvish populations of the First Age, the armies of the Union of Maedhros, the people of Gondolin, the soldiers of Doriath, the people of the Falas, the Nandor of Osiriand, reduced from numbers large enough to seriously contest Morgoth's armies over 6 centuries to a remnant gathered in Lindon at the new western shore, most of them so grief-tired that they eventually took the ships west and stopped being in Middle-earth's story entirely. Númenor, the greatest human civilization, a whole island civilization gone in a day. Tens of thousands of people, most of them not complicit in Ar-Pharazôn's hubris, drowned by the consequence of their king's choice. Elendil's 9 ships are the sum total of what survived. 9 ships. The kingdoms in exile. Gondor, over 3,000 years, loses. The Osgiliath Palantir to the Kinstrife, the White Tree in Sauron's first assault. King Onderhair and both his sons to the Wain Riders, the fleet to the Kinstrife's aftermath. King Minadil to the Corsairs, King Eärnur to the Witch King, the royal line itself to Eärnur's death. Arnor, everything. Cities, people, Palantiri, royal line, the kingdom itself, everything. The Dwarves, Thror's death. The wars of the Dwarves and Orcs. Azanul-Bizar, Fundin, Azargal. Dain and Brand at Dale during the War of the Ring. Balin and his company in Moria. The elves still in Middle-earth during the Lord of the Rings are a thin line of survivors, their major realms diminished, their populations depleted, their best craftsmen dead or departed, sustained by the 3 rings, whose power will end when the one ring is destroyed. This is what the free peoples of Middle-earth have in reserve when the War of the Ring starts. Not much, the last of the last. The final generation of resistance before either Sauron wins or something changes. Something changes. Through the specific alchemy of small choices and large consequences, and the mercy that Bilbo showed in a cave, and the loyalty that Sam maintained on a mountain, and the 1,000 years of elvish patience, and the 500-year oath of Rohan, and the 87 years of a ranger's preparation, something changes. And the something that changes is worth everything it cost. The world that emerges from the ring's destruction is depleted and grieving and smaller than anything it once was. But it is free. The specific freedom of a world where the eye is closed and the ring is gone, and the darkness that has been pressing against everything for 6,000 years has finally been pushed back. Not eliminated. Not permanently. The darkness never is in Tolkien's world, but pushed back far enough for long enough for the people who survive to rebuild something. They always rebuild something. They always have. Part 24. The Voices from the Dead. Water. Sam looked into the dead marshes and saw faces. Frodo saw faces. Gollum warned them not to follow the lights, not to look at the faces in the water. They were the faces of the soldiers who died at Dagorlad, preserved somehow in the marsh's spiritual atmosphere, still there 3,000 years after the last alliance ended. Most people experience this as a horror scene. The uncanny dead, the ghost lights, the warning against following. But look at it another way. Look at it from the perspective of everything we've discussed tonight. Those faces are the last alliance. The soldiers who died buying the victory that Isildur threw away by keeping the ring. They are still there in the marshland between the Anduin and Mordor. They are not gone. They are not forgotten. Not in any meaningful sense. They are in the path. You cannot walk to Mordor without passing through the graves of the people who tried before you. Tolkien put them there. In the path, so that Frodo would see them, so that every person attempting the quest would walk through the history of the previous attempts before reaching the place where the attempt would be made again. So that the weight of what came before was not abstract or theoretical, but physically present, faces in water right there in the road. This is the last thing I want to say tonight. The hidden wars of Middle-earth are not hidden because Tolkien forgot to tell you about them. They are not supplementary. They are the foundation. And the specific genius of putting those faces in the dead marshes, the faces of Dagorlad's dead in the path that Frodo must walk, is the most Tolkien thing in the mythology. The history is always in the path. It was in the path for the Rohirrim at the Pelennor, carrying 5 centuries of alliance and oath and debt back to the field of Celebrant. It was in the path for Aragorn standing at the Black Gate, every ancestor who died carrying Elendil's bloodline forward, through centuries of wilderness standing with him. It was in the path for Glorfindel at the ford of Bruinen, the first age in his eyes and the fire in his hand. It was in the path for Frodo, who had never heard of Dagor, Nuin-Gileath, or Nerneath Arnoediad, or the wars of Beleriand, who was carrying a ring without knowing its full history, who was walking toward a mountain he'd only heard about in songs, and who walked through the faces of the dead without knowing what they were, without knowing what they had done, or what it had cost them, or how directly their deaths, 6,000 years before his birth, had made his own quest possible. They made it possible anyway, whether he knew or not. That's how history works in Tolkien's world. The things that happen before you shape the world you walk into, whether you know about them or not. You know about them now. And the next time you watch Theoden raise his sword at the Pelennor, the next time you hear the horns of the Rohirrim in the dark, the next time you see Aragorn stand at the Black Gate and speak to his soldiers, you'll hear underneath those moments the long percussion of everything that came before. Every battle, every death, every small act of mercy and loyalty and stubborn refusal to surrender. All of it reverberating forward. All of it still alive in the moment where it matters. All of it, 6,000 years of it, concentrated in the choice of a hobbit from the Shire to say yes. Day shall come again. Stay with us. We have not yet told you all of what it cost.